Okay, this is a review of Chapter 7, Errors in English, Guide to Correct Sentence Structure. Okay, so first the chapter talks about how we think in words and speak and write in sentences. So speech is much less formal, right, as we've talked about before. It's when we formalize our thoughts into the written word that we create sentences. So we can draft our papers using more informal wording, but as you edit each draft, you should start refining the grammar, the wording, and the sentence structure so your argument shines through while you cut all the crap that's not helping your paper or slowing down the flow or muddling the clarity of your paper. So the chapter also talks about discovering the faults in writing as the first step in fixing those errors so your paper becomes clear and effective. You have to look for them carefully. As we will discuss more in detail later when we focus on revisions specifically, you need to slowly and thoughtfully look through your drafts as it's easy to skim it and miss obvious spelling, grammar, or sentence structure errors. So you need to take your time. I recommend trying to read it aloud as well, since that can help you catch some of the errors that your brain corrected between your eyeballs and your brain's reading comprehension. Also, the longer you're writing your paper, the more drafts you've done. So you've gone over it a bunch, but it can still be easy to miss those things right in front of you that I'll see and mark you down for when I read your paper, right? So this is why I highly recommend using the writing tutors, whether it's the department, sociology writing tutor, or at the University Learning Center, to help you find those things that your brain ignores when you're reading through the paper. And then knowing why and how. So this is, sentences are supposed to be structured in a certain way. So knowing how that works can be a proactive way to avoid errors, because then you'll understand what should be the case. And like I've mentioned in previous lectures, you know a lot of this stuff already. It's just a matter of repeating it and reconnecting those parts of your brain. It's important to practice and read about these topics, even though learning them in the abstract seems trite and boring, right? There is a point to learning proper mechanics, and it's that our thoughts and messages are appropriately conveyed to the reader. The more you learn, the better you are at conveying your argument. Okay, so when it comes to sentence incompleteness, there are many ways that sentences can be ineffective. So it's important to pay attention to sentence structure as you're drafting and editing your drafts of your research paper in this class. So first up, a phrase is not a sentence. It's usually missing a verb or subject, or sometimes both. One example is the prepositional phrase, "on my way," which, if you're like me, you text to a person about 10 minutes before you actually left the house, right? "On my way" is not a complete sentence as it's missing the verb and subject. Phrases like this become common to us through texting and other forms of communication. So you have to be thoughtful when writing to avoid phrases that are normal in the culture but not appropriate to your research paper. And the fix can be easy for phrases. Add the subject or the verb that's missing, and now it's a complete sentence. So in the example of, you change "on my way" to "I am on my way home." The sentence is now rectified. It's clearer, right? Especially when it comes to research papers, you don't want to be ambiguous. You want to be straightforward so the reader can understand your arguments. Okay, so a dependent clause is not a sentence. So dependent clauses cannot stand alone. They typically need a small change in wording to become a complete sentence. So the best way to understand what a dependent clause is to differentiate it from an independent clause, which is a sentence that can stand on its own, that has a subject, a verb, and expresses a complete thought, right? While a dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but it's not a complete thought. An example would be "when I grow up." When, in this case, is a subordinating conjunction, as "when" is a word that can help you identify dependent clauses, right? It's one of a few words. Other examples would be starting a sentence with "because," right? As we know, that's not a complete thought, right? It's connecting back to the previous one. Sometimes it's as easy as putting in a semicolon there, or just adding, the necessary missing parts of that sentence to fix it, right? So if you instead corrected that clause "when I grow up" to, "I want to be a firefighter when I grow up," right? That's obviously a complete sentence. So that's the independent clause. So that's what we're looking for in your sentence structures, right? And you want to avoid starting a sentence with one construction and stopping or shifting to another. So sometimes parts of sentences do not have the appropriate coordinating clauses, which makes them sound or seem awkward. So again, often by reading them aloud, you can find some of these things. And we'll talk a little bit more about it as well when we talk about revisions, how to, find some of these errors and fix them in your paper drafts. And that's why Errors in English as a book is a very helpful thing, because for any of these particular things that we kind of barely touch on or go over in these lectures, there's an entire section in the book that shows you how to actually address those errors, right? The whole second half of the book. Okay, moving on to comma splice. Okay, so comma faults, incredibly common, right? This is one of those ones, it took me lots of years, right? This is one of those I still struggle with. I love throwing commas all over the place, right? So comma faults are considered bad punctuation, and there's, many simple mistakes that people make when they're writing. A comma, maybe as you're editing the sentence, the comma was already in there and you changed the kind of structure of the sentence, so now the comma is no longer relevant. And also, sometimes it can be kind of an indication that you're using too much passive voice. So a lot of these comma issues are incredibly common. So if that's something that you're facing, you're not alone, right? But specifically, a comma splice, that's when you join two independent clauses with a comma and no conjunction. So it's really just like a long run-on sentence with a punctuation error, depending on how you look at it. So often to fix a comma splice, it's as easy as splitting the two independent clauses, aka sentences, with a period, or maybe a semicolon if that's more appropriate, or adding a conjunction, like and, to correct the issue. So these are easy fixes, right? So common errors can be corrected. Sometimes you just need to divide the sentence, right? Swap a comma for a semicolon, subordinate one of the statements, or, add a conjunction. So comma errors, again, super common. Once you know the rules, super easy to repair. So another quick example is the sentence, I'm thinking of skipping the audio lecture, comma, it is really boring. Right? To fix the problem, you can divide it into two sentences. But it makes more sense in that context to use a semicolon because the second sentence does connect or rely on the first, right? So you have to kind of think about the relationship between those sentences when you're splitting them up, whether it's better to split them up with a period or a semicolon. So if you split up the sentence instead to say, I'm thinking of skipping the audio lecture, semicolon, it is really boring, right? Yeah, that would be more appropriate. Okay, all right, moving on to fused sentences. Fused sentences are just sentences where two independent statements are blended. So another word for fused sentences are run-on sentences. I'm sure you've heard that, right? So you should make sure each sentence is distinct and not trying to make multiple separate arguments. So it's easy to make these two sentences. Just make sure not to use the comma errors instead. So a long sentence isn't necessarily a run-on sentence. What makes it a fused or run-on sentence is if there's two sentences squished together without any conjunction or punctuation, like a comma, semicolon, period, any of those things, right? So an example of a run-on is, I love to write papers. I would write one every day if I had the time. To repair that, you would just put the period after papers. So you would say, I love to write papers, period. I would write one every day if I had the time, period. Right? So you just split them into two sentences, super easy peasy. Okay, word order. So meanings in the English language have to do with where a word is placed in a sentence. So this is why you need to be very critical of your word order to make sure your messages are being clearly conveyed. So word order in English is fixed for most speaking and writing. In English, sentences start with a subject and are immediately followed by a verb. To make the sentence a question, you switch the order. So I can say, he is a friend, or I can say, is he a friend? Right? To indicate that now I'm asking a question. So again, this is why word order is so important. Word order affects meanings. So it's important to understand when you're constructing your research papers. Okay, so one of the things they talk about with word order is misplaced modifiers. This is something also addressed in other lectures, but learning is repetition, so here we go. Modifiers are words, phrases, or clauses that add description to sentences. Typically, you'd find a modifier next to the word it logically describes. So for example, the word blue. If I asked you to add the word blue to this sentence, right, and here's the sentence. At a downtown dealership, Kara bought a truck from a salesman with a comb over. So where would you put blue in there? Right? Would it be the dealership is blue? The salesman? Right? Clearly blue should describe the car, or in this case, I guess the truck, right? So it should be before the word truck. When modifiers are misplaced, meanings can get confused, or sometimes the sentence becomes ambiguous as to its meanings. So dangling modifiers are similar. Dangling modifiers are misplaced words, phrases, or clauses in a sentence, and dangling modifiers don't modify anything. That's why they're dangling. They're kind of hanging by themselves. It misses the words it intends to modify and just hangs in a sentence without modifying the subject. So modifiers should clarify or give more detail about a concept. So for example, after reading the original study, the article remains unconvincing. Right? So if you're reading that as the, dangling modifier there, it doesn't really make sense that the article remains unconvincing, right? Instead, it should read something like, after reading the original study, I find the article unconvincing. So this has a clarity, and it's specific to who is convinced. In this case, the researcher is not convinced, versus in the previous sentence example, where the article is not convinced, it's as if the article has a mind of its own. So in that example, the modifier confuses the meaning, right? That the article has a mind of its own. Okay, moving on. Split constructions. So you need to keep logically related elements of a sentence together, as that will help improve the clarity of your paper. To understand what a split infinitive is, it's helpful to first review what is an infinitive, right? An infinitive is the basic form of a verb that's not used with inflection except for the preposition to before it. For example, to sign, to eat, to write, right? To plus a verb is an infinitive. So a split infinitive is when a word or phrase, clause, any of those fun things, comes between to and a verb, right? So that construction is a split infinitive. So this is not considered a large error, as some of the other ones we've discussed, but it still can affect the clarity of your statements. So my favorite example of a split infinitive is here on the slide, right? It's the beginning of Star Trek episodes. To boldly go where no one has gone before, right? It should technically be to go boldly to make it proper English, but maybe Roddenberry figured that the language would change in the future. Okay, so moving on to separating the parts of a verb phrase. So you should avoid splitting an auxiliary verb and a main verb, such as splitting has been. Sentences are more correct when these kinds of words are connected. And when it comes to subject and verb, preposition and object, it's okay to separate these things, but it can again sound awkward. So an example from the book shows how it can work, but most of the time, again, it's awkward. So saying Jack raised his hand, right? That's correct. But if the sentence instead says Jack, comma, as soon as he heard the question, comma, raised his hand, is not as correct. It can sound more confusing when splitting up the sentence with the phrase, as soon as he heard the question. So the parts are split, so again, it can work, but most of the time it indicates an error. And then there's coordinate elements. So this is when you need to bring together things that are the same to make the sentence clearer. So changing something like, unless the blizzard lets up, we cannot make it to the mountain lodge unless the roads are passable. To, you change that, and this is the book example, you change that to, unless the blizzard lets up and the road is passable, we cannot make it to the mountain lodge. So combining both of the unless statements makes way more sense, and it eliminates the sense of wordiness in your paper. Okay, so when it comes to logical sentences, the three major steps towards better writing are seeing to it that sentences are complete, properly punctuated, and with the words in the correct order. Sometimes that's not enough, and you also need to take into account logic, right? So omissions are a big part of this. So omissions of a necessary verb is one of the issues they discuss in the chapter. In both speaking and writing, we tend to omit some words, right? Something like, he always did that, and he always will, right? When it should be, he always will do that, to make it a complete sentence. But largely, grammar's normative to what we're using in our lives, what we're used to hearing. So sometimes these things slip into our papers. So it's fine that these things make their way in your paper. The real key is to keep editing your drafts to find these issues before the paper's submitted and graded. So they also talked about omissions of other essential words. So when something necessary is omitted, it makes the sentence awkward, or it can really change the meaning. So this is important to the context of this class. As you're talking about complex issues in your paper, the last thing you want to do is make it more confusing. This again can be as simple as forgetting an article like the or an. And then there's omissions of words in comparison. So it's hard to compare when you're only talking about one thing. So, one example would be, she has the biggest feet. You're like, okay, compared to what, right? It makes you wonder, biggest compared to what? Instead, if you said, she has the biggest feet in her school, that would be a comparison that explains and defines that comparison. Otherwise, the meaning changes it can be vague, right, when those words are omitted. And again, you don't want things to be vague or ambiguous because you don't want people to have to try and interpret what you're saying. It should be clear to them. Okay, when it comes to mixed or double comparisons, if you try to compare more than two things in a sentence, this can also cause confusion by mixing what is being compared to what. This also connects to confusing blends. So depending on your writing style, people tend to use certain phrases or blends such as regardless, irrespective, which some blend into the word irregardless, which is not really a word, but people still tirelessly use it, especially in research papers, so don't do that. Then there's double negatives. So in standard English, each subject-predicate construction should only have one negative form. Double negatives are common in our language, such as, that won't do you no good, or I didn't see nothing, right? Or he's not going nowhere. Which in proper English would be, he's going nowhere. Only one negative needed, right? So this is something common in other languages like French, but it's considered grammatically incorrect in English. And then last on here is the misuse of dependent clauses. So again, we talked about dependent clauses before. Dependent clauses functions as parts of speech. So a mistake you can make is using an adverbial clause in place of a noun or noun phrase, such as stealing is when one takes someone's property. When there being the word that's being used inappropriately, right? Instead, you should say something like stealing is the act of taking property, right? Instead of is when one takes someone's property, right? Because when, again, is trying to reference timing. Okay, moving on. Consistent sentence structure. So this makes for clarity and effective communication, keeping elements consistent. It's not difficult, but it does require some thought and care. So again, we talked about these a little bit before, but tense is the time of a verb, right? Meaning the past, the present, and the future. So when you have a sentence, you wouldn't start with a past tense and then start to present, change the rest of the sentence to present tense, right? So sometimes this happens not necessarily within one sentence, but within a section of your paper where you're using a past tense to describe research, and then you start describing the research in a present or future tense. And so again, that's confusing for the reader. So just make sure if you're, talking about research and you say something like was, meaning past tense instead of is, as present tense, you keep that consistent when you're moving through that particular research study or that particular section of your paper. Okay, subject and voice. So voice is a term that represents whether the subject is acting, right? So active voice is when the subject is doing the action, and passive voice is when the action is being done upon, right? So we've kind of already explored active and passive a little bit in this class, but it's important to understand that if you're using passive voice in your research paper, it should be done for a reason to focus on the object instead of the subject. The problem of always using passive voice, especially in research for sociology, is that oftentimes we want to put more focus on the subject because the subject is a human, right? Or a group of people that, we're examining, and you don't really want to lose sight of that sometimes. If you want to focus more on what's happening to the subject, right, then yes, passive phrasing makes more sense. But most of the time, you want it to be much more active voice, right? Okay, some of these other ones are pretty straightforward. They're kind of obvious, like use of number. You shouldn't switch from single to plural in a sentence, right? That's pretty obvious. If you do, it just sounds weird. It's confusing, right? And so pronouns need to agree in number with their antecedents as well. When it comes to class or person of pronouns, you try to keep with your word choices, right? So if you refer to someone in one way, again, you're not going to switch halfway through the sentence. Like, let's say you're using pronouns like gendered pronouns, right? If you're referring to someone whose gender pronoun is he, you're not going to then halfway through the sentence start saying she or they or changing that pronoun as you go, right? So that's, kind of a clear, but again, those things can be easy things to mess up and miss because when you're doing a spell check, it's not going to find she or he, right? Okay, using figures of speech. So again, here the key is consistency. You don't want to switch back and forth between figurative and literal figures of speech. And then use of mood is another important thing. So mood can be a helpful tool for a writer. You want to make sure the mood of your paper fits the scope of the assignment. So mood can take readers with you on an emotional journey. Mood can convey central themes of your work. It can help readers identify with the content. So mood can be affected by word choice, types of verbs, all sorts of things. The important part is to understand for this course is that you want to be in control of the mood of your paper so that you can steer the reader towards your arguments. Okay, so unified and concise sentences. So a big problem that happens oftentimes in research papers are these rambling sentences with too many details. A huge one for this class, and just research papers in general, because students often include way too much information about a source or article instead of just explaining the part that's specifically relevant to their paper, right? So adding, oh, here was the author's name, and here's the article, title, and they did the study at the University of Wisconsin, and they used 5,700 participants and did a double-blind, two-tiered, blah, 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 and, they did this over this many years at this place, and none of that matters. What did they find, right? Oh, they found that 40% of participants experienced blank. Okay, put that, and don't give me all the other crap, because it slows down the paper so much, and it's just like, the more you read it on my end, you're like, what are you trying to say? What's all this info about, right? So you want to make sure you get rid of all of that excess so that what you're trying to say pops right out, right? The same thing with unrelated ideas in the same sentence. So again, it can make your paper confusing, especially when it comes to research papers that are already complicated because of the subject matter, right? Due to the content that you're exploring. So be clear, be concise. Make sure you split those sentences up and provide clarity. When it comes to wordy phrases and expressions, so wordy phrases and expressions are basically the opposite of what you need to do. What you need to do is be concise, right? Use fewer words to convey an idea clearly. Reading sprawling sentences can feel overwhelming, confusing, boring. It can confuse the reader by making it hard for them to quickly identify the main point or what it is you're trying to communicate. So concise writing instead will help grab and hold your reader's attention. It's also likely to be more memorable and make a lasting impact on the reader. You want to also reduce predication. So predicates are the part of the sentence or clause that contain a verb and state something about the subject. So you want to reduce predication in your paper, which you can do by making sure the subject of a sentence is not doing more than one thing. So if the sentence is, let's say, we completed the paper and got a good grade, that works. But if the sentence instead was, we completed the paper and got a good grade and passed the class, the sentence is talking about too much at the same time, right? Another one is unnecessary details, as I kind of already rambled about before, right? Big one for paper submissions in this class. And I see this very often in early paper submissions, and I think part of the blame lies with those people you wrote papers for before me. But yeah, clearly, it's time for an update, right? Maybe in previous classes you were trying to fill the space to meet a certain word count or page length requirement. So you added all the info, right? Or maybe it's the inevitable evolution of making people do annotated bibliographies. So by the time you transition in this class to writing a research paper style, all that unnecessary information comes over too. Specifically, I see this in two ways. One, students often include the name of the article that's long and sprawling. Two, students often include way too much information from a cited source, such as the methodology, number of participants, university it was done at, Like I said before, often all of that is irrelevant. Not only does it slow down the pace of your paper, it confuses the reader since you have to sort through all those words to figure out what the point is. And really, to me, it conveys that you don't know what the point is because you're just basically cutting and pasting from a source and not at all explaining or analyzing their findings and how that connects to your paper, right? So when you're editing drafts of your paper, look at these things and ask, is this important? Does this information from the source matter to my argument in this paper? Or is it something I can cut? Right? And then useless repetition. Another issue in many papers, right? Sometimes in research papers, it's the overuse of transitional phrases like furthermore. Every damn paragraph becomes furthermore, furthermore, furthermore. But if you say furthermore tons of times, it becomes incredibly repetitive and the brain starts tuning out. And again, transitional phrases should be specific to the kind of transition that they are, right? Furthermore doesn't work for every transition. Anyway, you're not always furthering. Sometimes you're introducing new ideas. The same issue can happen when you have limited word variety and you keep using the same words over and over and over. It can really bore and confuse the reader, right? So if you change or remove some of that repetition, the flow of the paper speeds up and it's so much more enjoyable to read, right? And this is what you want. This is why we're going over this, because you want to be in the driver's seat of your paper. You want to read your draft and be like, yes, right? Like how you feel when you put on like your favorite outfit that makes you look damn great, right? That's how your paper should feel for you too. We're just so used to scrambling to write things an hour before they're due that we're not used to the idea that we can actually craft these things over time and be extremely proud of them and happy about them, right? So that when you have a draft that you're turning it in, it might not be perfect, but you know that you put in the work that it's going to get a good grade, right? So this is why we're reviewing all this information. And like I said, Errors in English is a great tool because if there's any particular issue that as we're going through this lecture, you're like, oh, I think I might have that problem, right? I might be using a lot of useless repetition. Well, in the actual textbook, like I said, at the second half of the book, you just look it up, it shows you, it gives you an examples, and it shows you how to remedy those things in your paper. So keep that in mind when you're reading the chapters, when you're going through these lectures. If a little alarm bell goes off and says, oh, that's kind of what my paper sounds like, that's why the book is there as a resource for you.